4 arms, 4 lightsabers, each one stripped from a Jedi who no longer needed it. In Genndy Tartakovsky's 2003 Clone Wars microseries, General Grievous arrives at the Battle of Hypori, and the camera watches him work. Ki-Adi-Mundi, Aayla Secura, Shaak Ti, Jedi Masters, among the finest warriors the Order had ever trained, taken apart with the methodical indifference of something built for exactly this purpose. Shaak Ti ends up with his hand around her throat, feet off the ground, her decades of training useless against 40 kilograms of cybernetic grip. These aren't mid-level Jedi, these are the Order's best, getting dismantled. This is the version of Grievous the fandom still mourns, the one that made Jedi Masters look like they'd forgotten what they were. Anakin Skywalker spent 13 years being shaped by one teacher. Everything in his combat psychology, the overwhelming aggression, the brilliance under pressure, the instinct to close distance and end fights fast, came from a man who watched him grow from a scared boy from Tatooine into the most powerful Force user alive. Obi-Wan Kenobi built that. What the saga never pauses to state directly is where Obi-Wan built it from. Before Naboo, before any of the composure the fandom treats as Obi-Wan's defining characteristic, there was a gifted young man with a documented reputation for impulsiveness, for acting on instinct over protocol, for pushing against institutional authority rather than working within it, for being brilliant in the specific way that makes the people responsible for you lose sleep at night. The Jedi Council had real doubts about him. Those doubts weren't baseless. Qui-Gon Jinn had to actively argue for him against that institutional skepticism, and the Council's hesitation was grounded in something observable. This Padawan was volatile, stubborn, and combustible in exactly the ways that mattered. In every meaningful psychological respect, a proto-Anakin. Walking the same halls, drawing the same wariness, carrying the same gap between feeling and discipline that the Order spent decades failing to manage in others. Understanding this is the structural key to every fight that follows, because what Obi-Wan became, and what it specifically cost him to get there, is the mechanism that decided the saga's outcome. Not prophecy, not raw power. A man who went through the fire early, made a choice in it, and couldn't be moved from that choice again by any pressure the galaxy subsequently applied. The Jedi Order trained its warriors ruthlessly and produced extraordinary power. Grievous killed them at Hypori. Palpatine manipulated their greatest warrior into burning the rest from the inside. The specific failure was this: managing emotion is different from transcending it. The Order taught warriors to suppress what they feel. It didn't reliably produce warriors who had genuinely passed through their worst moments, decided on the other side who they were going to be, and couldn't be dragged back by external pressure. Grievous exploited that gap at Hypori with mechanical efficiency. Palpatine identified the same gap in every Jedi he manipulated and pressed on it with surgical precision. Against this strategy, technical mastery was insufficient. The Order produced extraordinarily powerful fighters who were, at the moment of maximum psychological pressure, fragile. The transformation that closed that gap started in a reactor shaft on Naboo. Qui-Gon Jinn wasn't simply Obi-Wan's master in the formal sense. In an order that officially discouraged attachment and treated emotional investment in apprentices as a liability to be managed, Qui-Gon had shepherded Obi-Wan toward knighthood over real institutional resistance, argued for him against the Council's skepticism, treated him as a person rather than a vessel for tradition, and was the one being in Obi-Wan's adult life who had actively fought for him when the institution would have set him aside. Then Darth Maul's blade went through Qui-Gon's torso. Obi-Wan was 20 feet away across a charged force field, close enough to watch the light go out, unable to stop it. The volatile young man who had been Qui-Gon's gamble was now standing with everything stripped. Every instinct he had ever followed: act fast, trust the feeling, let what moves you decide what you do, running at full voltage. When the shield dropped, he somersaulted over Maul, caught Qui-Gon's lightsaber mid-fall, and cut him in two. Grief at full current. The strike was precise. The spatial clarity that move required shouldn't have been accessible to a man in that emotional state. It was accessible. He felt everything and let none of it direct the hand. That space, between feeling everything and being controlled by nothing, is the lesson his entire subsequent life is built on. Learned here, at the worst possible cost, in the worst possible moment. Years later, when Padme died, Anakin went to Mustafar and became a murderer. He let Palpatine shape the grief into a weapon and point it at every surviving Jedi in the galaxy. Two men at structurally identical crossroads, a beloved person dead, the grief enormous, a direction available for the rage, and they went opposite ways. Every fight, every outcome, every consequence that followed is the record of those two diverging paths. The fights after Naboo built the pattern methodically. In the asteroid field above Geonosis, Jango Fett deployed a methodology built on technological cascade. Each new threat designed to force the opponent into pure reaction until they lost their own approach in the flood of responses. Obi-Wan's approach didn't cascade. He survived, planted the tracker, and extracted exactly what the mission required. The pattern was there in miniature. Count Dooku presented a harder problem. Dooku was a combat aristocrat with decades more experience. His dueling style built for precision lightsaber engagements that found the gaps in an opponent's guard rather than crashing against their strength. Against Obi-Wan's more acrobatic approach at Geonosis, Dooku was simply better. He wounded Obi-Wan, took him off his feet, and ended the engagement decisively. Those losses are real facts in the record, not softened by any tactical excuse. What Obi-Wan did with them is where his evolution becomes visible. He kept coming back, refined his approach across engagements, and built something progressively more patient and defensive. The most defensively oriented approach in the Jedi arsenal, built on patience and the willingness to make an aggressive opponent exhaust themselves against a wall. Against Dooku's precision, that tighter guard eliminated the openings Dooku had exploited. Against Grievous's four-blade display, that economy of motion meant there was nothing to drive into panic. Against Anakin's power attacks on Mustafar, the same patient geometry held. He came back to Dooku and refined his approach in response. That willingness to dismantle his own trained instincts and construct something more effective from the wreckage isn't what the Order routinely produced. It's what the reactor shaft made possible. A man who had already learned to override his instincts at their loudest, who understood from the inside that the pull toward the familiar response isn't the same as the correct response. Asajj Ventress and Savage Opress operated on Grievous's psychological logic. Overwhelming aggression, sustained intimidation, fear deployed as a force multiplier designed to make continued resistance feel costlier than surrender. Against both, Obi-Wan fought patient. He refused to be drawn into the emotional register his opponents were broadcasting. He survived both engagements, remained functional, continued the mission. Ventress, at her most dangerous, was a nightmare built on speed and viciousness. Savage was pure brute power with Sith conditioning underneath. Neither could find the surface that Grievous's display needed to land on. The pattern held. Darth Maul's return in the Clone Wars changed the nature of the test. He came back on nothing but hatred and purpose, reassembled from his own shattered state, kept functional through years of isolation by that alone. He understood Obi-Wan's psychology with clinical precision because he had experienced the direct product of it at Naboo. He understood that grief was the lever, so he didn't challenge Obi-Wan to a duel. He took Duchess Satine Kryze and killed her in front of him, slowly, close enough for Obi-Wan to hold her while it happened. This was the identical trap that had consumed Anakin Skywalker. A beloved person dying in his arms, the grief structurally available to become fuel for someone else's agenda. Palpatine had run this play on Anakin across years of careful cultivation and produced Darth Vader. Maul ran it on Obi-Wan with deliberate calculation, designed specifically around what he knew about where the foundation was thin. Obi-Wan was emotionally devastated by Satine's death. The canon record is unambiguous. And he didn't succumb to anger or hatred. He was gutted. The grief didn't make him weaponizable. The man who had stood at that same pull in a reactor shaft and chosen otherwise had built something at that moment that Maul's precision couldn't reach. Here, the Grievous Anakin parallel becomes structural. Grievous is engineered aggression, built to use overwhelming physical force to break Jedi psychologically before finishing them with their own weapons. He collects lightsabers from defeated opponents, surrounds himself with material evidence of conquest, and relies entirely on opponents reacting to his display rather than executing their own approach. His entire mechanism depends on the opponent losing their own thread in the noise of his performance. A patient opponent who has genuinely transcended the reactive pull encounters something different. The mechanism opens like a door. Anakin Skywalker on Mustafar is the same psychological entity, with force sensitivity multiplied on top and the most sophisticated Sith conditioning in history layered underneath. Also defined by conquest, by an overwhelming need to have his power acknowledged, by a combat psychology that functions best when opponents break or validate him by fighting on his emotional terms. The original Revenge of the Sith script reportedly had Palpatine actively stoking Anakin's suspicion that Obi-Wan and Padme were having an affair, a targeted psychological operation designed to transform every source of trust in Anakin's life into evidence of conspiracy, ensuring that what arrived on Mustafar was rage specifically aimed at the one person whose continued composure Anakin found intolerable. Against reactive opponents, Anakin was nearly unbeatable. The trap worked exactly the same way as Grievous's. In the canonical record, across every engagement the saga documents, Obi-Wan was functionally the only patient one. Utapau makes this concrete. The sinkhole city descends in concentric rings of carved stone, and in a docking bay at the bottom of one of those rings, Grievous had chosen to wait. 3 years of systematically defeating Jedi Masters gave him no particular reason to adjust expectations for one more general walking in alone. His entire combat psychology was built on a single verified insight. 4 spinning lightsabers, the mechanical aggression that registered no pain and carried no survival instinct to exploit, would shatter any Jedi's trained composure and drive them into the reactive spiral where his precision closed the trap. Every Jedi who died at his hands died to that specific mechanism. Performance, reaction, escalation, end. Obi-Wan kept the fight in close quarters and amputated 2 of Grievous's robotic arms. The tactical reasoning is where the psychological thesis becomes visible in action. Grievous's advantage is range and multiplicity. 4 blades in open space create an environment the opponent must manage rather than engage. And managing means reacting, means the trap is working. Close quarters turns 4 arms into a crowding problem and eliminates the theatrical intimidation of the spinning display, because performing to an opponent already inside your guard doesn't work. Close quarters is also the most physically dangerous option available to a single fighter facing that configuration. A fighter shaken by the performance doesn't choose it. A fighter who has already metabolized this psychological template, who has seen the same overwhelming aggressive dynamic in Ventress, in Savage, in Maul, across prior engagements, and who arrives at Utapau having already decided what his emotions are permitted to do to his tactical choices, chooses close quarters because it's correct. The display found no surface. 2 arms came off. Then Grievous fled, and Obi-Wan picked up a blaster, shot him, set the weapon down, and reportedly noted, with evident sincerity, that he found the whole business uncivilized. He used the pragmatic tool and kept his aesthetic opinion of it intact, simultaneously, without contradiction. The implicit culture of the Jedi Order positioned the lightsaber as identity marker as much as tool. Fighting any other way represented a departure from what a Jedi fundamentally is. Grievous had built his entire approach around the assumption that Jedi would maintain this constraint even as it killed them, that their identity framework would hold even against a weaponized understanding of its weaknesses. The Jedi at Hypori either forgot they had the Force when it mattered, or refused to adapt their methods when adaptation was exactly what survival required. The 2003 microseries makes this visible. 4 lightsabers spinning in a dark corridor, and Jedi Masters responding to the performance rather than dismantling it. His refusal to let professional identity constrain what he was willing to do is the thesis made visible in one action. Once you've decided your emotional state can't dictate your tactics, the logical extension is that your trained assumptions can't either. The Jedi who died to Grievous were killed in part by assumptions about how Jedi fight that Obi-Wan had stopped carrying somewhere in the gap between Naboo and Utapau. One blaster shot, a disapproving remark. The argument stands in miniature. Mustafar runs the same template at full intensity against a far more familiar opponent. Both fighters knew each other's styles completely. 13 years of shared training meant the engagement was a technical stalemate from the first exchange. Their footwork and counter timing too intertwined for either to find an opening through technique alone. His tight defensive geometry against Anakin's power attacks produced an equilibrium that pure skill couldn't resolve. Psychological foundation had to decide it. Anakin's foundation was built on a need that Obi-Wan's state made structurally impossible to satisfy. Validation from someone who was refusing to be a validator, who was grief-stricken and heartbroken, but not emotionally available as a target, who was simply there trying to bring someone home, and recognized with devastating clarity that it wasn't going to work. A deep-seated vulnerability, a constant, desperate need to prove himself to Obi-Wan and the Jedi Order, had been running underneath every shared mission for 13 years. Palpatine had found that need and built Mustafar around it. Anakin needed Obi-Wan to crack, to fight on his emotional terms, to finally break composure and confirm, through that crack, that Anakin had always been right and always deserved more than the Order ever gave him. Anakin overextended. He had overextended in this exact direction across 13 years of shared history, the same impulsive reach past the defensible position that had once concerned the Council, the same combustible gap between feeling and discipline. Obi-Wan recognized it because he had carried the same gap, not as an observer watching a student's flaw from outside, but as someone who had stood at the same edge, in a reactor shaft on Naboo, with grief running at full current, and chosen otherwise. That lived knowledge, the specific interior weight of what it feels like to stand at that pole and not follow it, was the margin on Mustafar. 13 years of watching someone he had raised walk steadily toward the same cliff he had once nearly fallen from himself, unable to stop it, and on a volcano planet at the Republic's end, watching him go over. Mace Windu's duel with Palpatine in the Chancellor's office is the primary historical complication to this record, and it deserves a genuine hearing. Mace took Palpatine, the most sophisticated Sith architect in a millennium, the being who had engineered the Order's extinction from inside its own structure, to the apparent edge of defeat. Palpatine was disarmed and at blade point. Mace's tool for doing it was reportedly Vapad, details of which sit in contested and insufficiently verified sources, described as a lightsaber form of his own creation that channels the practitioner's own darkness back against the enemy, theoretically turning a dark side opponent's aggressive power into a mirror that defeats itself. Against Palpatine specifically, whose combat psychology runs on overwhelming dark side aggression, the pod may represent the most precisely calibrated counter the Order ever produced. Mace came closer to stopping Palpatine than any other Jedi managed. That fact deserves no minimization. Whether Palpatine was genuinely losing, or staging the moment to position Anakin's intervention as his salvation, is one of the legitimately contested questions in this material, and the canon doesn't settle it definitively. What can be measured is this. Mace's approach was calibrated for one specific type of opponent, the singular ultimate threat, the being at the apex of the dark side hierarchy. Obi-Wan's approach held against Maul across engagements, against Ventress and Savage Opress through the Clone Wars, against Jango Fett in the Geonosis asteroid field, against Grievous at Utapau, against Anakin on Mustafar, against Vader across the encounters that followed, every variation of the same psychological template across 2 decades, against every circumstance the galaxy produced. One approach was built for a specific enemy, the other held against the entire category. Whether precision against the final boss, interrupted before completion, outweighs a career of systematic effectiveness against the entire template, that question belongs in the comments. The Mace Windu camp has a real case. Make yours against it. Here is what can be stated without qualification. The Chosen One prophecy was fulfilled when Anakin Skywalker threw Palpatine into a reactor shaft in Return of the Jedi. Anakin made that throw. The man who made it was only alive in that moment because Obi-Wan had walked away from Mustafar, had chosen, against every strategic argument, to leave the burning man on the lava rather than finish it. A father looked at his son's unmasked face in the Death Star's throne room and found something worth dying for. That father had been shaped, for the first 13 years of his life as a Jedi, by a master who had decided in a reactor shaft that grief wasn't permitted to make his decisions for him. Obi-Wan didn't fulfill the prophecy himself. He built the conditions that made fulfillment possible, won every fight against the psychological template that broke every other Jedi the galaxy sent against it, left the one person capable of completing the prophecy alive when tactical logic argued against it, and then went to the desert to wait. Tatooine is nothing like a battlefield. The twin suns move across the same orange sky every day. The Jundland wastes aren't dramatic. From 19 BBY onward, a hermit lived at their edge and watched a boy grow up on a farm 9 kilometers away. In approximately 1 BBY, years into the exile, patient through the entire interval, Obi-Wan began that boy's training in earnest. For most of the 19 years between Mustafar and the events of A New Hope, he was doing one thing: remaining, stable, available, present without urgency. Every version of overwhelming aggression the saga had sent against him, Grievous at Utapau, Anakin on Mustafar, Maul across the encounters that followed, had relied on the same mechanism: performance, pressure, the expectation of a reaction. All of them found the same thing. A man who had already decided, in the worst moment of his young life, exactly who he was and what his emotions were permitted to cost him. The boy on the farm grew up and threw the Emperor into the reactor shaft. Anakin Skywalker was the instrument that ended the Sith. What survived Palpatine's conditioning long enough to act in that throne room? The recognition of his son, the love that broke through decades of armor, the choice to lift the Emperor rather than watch a child die, had been built by a teacher who understood from the inside what it costs to make that choice rather than the other one. Every fight won by refusing to be provoked. Every moment of chosen precision over reactive instinct. Every time Obi-Wan absorbed what the people he loved cost him and refused to let it become a weapon in someone else's hands. All of it architecture. All of it preparation for a desert and a boy and a 19-year wait. The galaxy ran every variation of overwhelming aggression it had against him. He answered every version the same way. The prophecy got fulfilled because he built the man who could fulfill it, and had the discipline to step back and let history run. Argue Mace Windu in the comments, genuinely, because it deserves a real argument. Subscribe if you want more of this.